active suspension. Do you remember it? The kryptonite of Formula One, so to speak, a revolutionary mechanism that appeared in the 1980s and peaked in 1992 and 1993. It suddenly transformed all the tracks into a billiard table, a carpet, eliminating most of the imperfections in the asphalt and compensating for changes in attitude. That's right, the attitude of racing cars in high-speed corners, low-speed corners, going over curbs, and braking. It's about this revolutionary mechanism which, like many others, was banned. We're going to talk about today on Splash and Go. Let's go! First of all, an important conceptual piece of information. It wasn't Williams that invented it. Active suspension in Formula One. And it shouldn't be called active. It was reactive. The one who clarifies this is the guy who brought it to near perfection. At Williams, Patrick Head said, the suspension will effectively be active. When we can anticipate, scan the asphalt with radar, and the car leaves the pits already aware of the imperfections. The active suspension that existed in Formula One was reactive because it responded to changes in attitude and imperfections in the asphalt. That said, where did it all begin? What needs led to this? So, it's important to explain this concept of car attitude. Once again, we're borrowing something from aviation in Formula One because attitude is used to talk about airplanes in flight. Attitude, a racing car, not just in Formula One, rolls to one side in corners, rolls to the other. Under braking, the nose dips. All of this has aerodynamic repercussions. The more refined the car is in aerodynamics. In 1982, Lotus had a problem with ground effect and porpoising. Do you remember him? That's right, porpoising, which reappeared in 2022. 40 years later, we explain the phenomenon of today's cars to then talk about the theme from 40 years ago, the porpoising or the bouncing, which comes from porpoise, an animal similar to a small dolphin that swims in that way, lends its name to this strange phenomenon that appeared in cars in 2022, since a large part of the aerodynamic pressure is generated from underneath in today's cars. They have a tendency for the rear to be sucked down towards the asphalt. I've already done an experiment here with a spoon to show you. If I can find it, I'll ask the editor to put it here. The curved surface underneath the spoon simulates the effect of the Venturi tunnels under a Formula One car. The refrigerator magnet simulates the dampers here, balancing the downforce and the suspension that the car is sitting on. So if I'm reproducing this correctly, the experiment from the Spanish TV during the Bahrain Grand Prix this past Sunday, the tendency is that when the accelerated air from our windmaker passes underneath here, it will create a low pressure zone that will lower the spoon. When the spoon touches the table, the airflow underneath it stops or decreases significantly, and then the damper counterbalances and makes it come back up. When it moves away from the table, the airflow, which will be continuous, creates a low pressure zone again. Downforce, in quotes, and it goes down again. And then the phenomenon repeats itself successively, just like the race car bouncing, porpoising, hopping down the straight in Formula One. Shall we see? When the rear is sucked down and the floor enters a neutral angle in relation to the oncoming air, suddenly the floor loses aerodynamic efficiency. The suspension springs overcome the pressure and push the car up. When they push the car up, the phenomenon starts over and the rear keeps doing this hundreds of times. This has a problem. It turns, driving the car into a nightmare. It becomes unpredictable, the contact of the tire surface with the asphalt. It's bad, and this harms the quality of what's called ride quality, meaning the smoothness of the car rolling over the asphalt. This problem today was already showing up back then in the past. Every car depends on a platform. Stable. Record this, and what is a stable platform? Well, think of the car sitting on top of 4 sets of springs, the front ones and the back ones. When it's just sitting still, everything's fine. But at the end of a straight, for example, like the one at Monza, you slam the brakes from 340 to 80 at the first chicane. And the tendency is that all that weight transfer from the energy, which will be involved in braking, sinks the rear. This also happens with your car. This also happens in the corners. It turns this way, it spins that way, it turns that way, it spins this way, and even under acceleration, the rear settles down, it's less noticeable, but all these changes happen too. This is where the term comes in, car attitude. This is one attitude, this is another attitude, this is yet another attitude. They also influence the air that's passing underneath. Rodrigo, but Formula One cars have stiff suspension. It's low, changes, millimeters. Yes, millimeters. But when you're like this on the asphalt, this already makes all the difference. 25%, quarter. So every change in that platform affects the air that passes underneath. And the ground effect cars, whether from today or 40 years ago, also depend on the stability of the platform. It's no coincidence who has managed to solve these problems nowadays, like Red Bull in the beginning, and then Ferrari and McLaren. They've done well in recent years, and those who haven't figured it out, for example, Mercedes, are still struggling. Like Red Bull in the beginning, and then Ferrari and McLaren, they've done well in recent years. And those who haven't figured it out, for example, Mercedes, are still struggling. And then you're thinking, wait a minute, weren't you going to talk about suspension? Are you talking to me about aerodynamics? Yes. It's all one interconnected thing, all together, mixed up. So the ideal, the enchanted dream of all Formula One engineers is for that platform to be stable. In any condition, under any change of direction, to one side or the other, or while braking. This helps with performance, this helps with driving. The Formula One driver wants a predictable car. In other words, he can anticipate the reactions. The more predictable the car is, the faster you can go. There's one more thing. Today's race car starts a race with 160 kilo of fuel to make it to the end. So you agree with me that the suspension setup has to take these two moments into account. All the weight at the beginning, almost nothing. In the end, you have to agree with me that one of those two moments is going to be compromised. Because you need a car with the suspension stiff enough so that the floor doesn't hit the asphalt at the beginning when the tank is full, but that will compromise the drivability. In the end, when the car is light, you end up losing out on one of the ends, possibly both. All of this would change if you could create what's called synthetic dampers. And that was the first name for active suspension when it was just an idea. Lotus had this problem that was troubling all of Formula One and was looking for a solution. Williams, at the same time facing the same problems, would think other solutions. But first, let's talk about Lotus. Peter Wright from Colin Chapman's team of engineers had an idea that borrowed from ambulances. He had already seen in England that they lowered to allow for a more comfortable and safe boarding of patients, and that the same mechanism during trips with patients coming or going to the hospitals. It kept the vehicle at a constant height, both on the outside and inside of the curbs, and also during braking at all times. With that in mind, he thought, what if we could create a suspension that would respond to the car's changes in direction, compensating for the movements? When the driver slams on the brakes and the rear drops, the damper would stiffen, holding that position. When the driver turns right and the car wants to roll out, to the left, this mechanism stiffens that side and prevents that from happening, or at least reduce the amplitude of the movement. This would keep the so-called platform stable, and the synthetic damper was created, or at least conceived. The plan was to replace the springs, which only have one type of behavior, with something that, once controlled, wouldn't compress, but would compress when it needed to. Instead of springs, we would then have a hydraulic system, almost like a piston. From the arms of the tractors, beautiful? But remember, we're talking about 1982, a year before the ODM was born. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, right? All of this happened 10 years before that state of the art. The active suspension from Williams would appear. It would be 10 years of a lot of trial and error to make this contraption work. And before it could work, to think about how to execute it. The technical challenge was immense. Imagine that back then computers were the size of square meters. My dad says that when he was in engineering school around that time, a computer, it was a building. Inside the printer, it was possible for a person to enter. And the blessed data processing, which today is done in milliseconds, back then took hours, days, weeks, depending on what you needed. So 3 things were necessary. 1, sensors that would constantly monitor the height variations of the car at key points. A computer that would receive this information and process it at a very high speed in time. 4, 3, the hydraulic systems. Included in there were valves, hoses, wiring, and actuators that needed to work exactly when you needed them to, with the necessary response. All of this had to be reliable, lightweight, and miniaturized to fit inside the car. In addition, it was necessary for this development to be done in secret, obviously, so that no one else would find out and take advantage, always facing a very hostile environment inside a race car. All sorts of heating, shaking, and so on. It will affect the system. Lotus even debuted the synthetic shock absorbers in the 1982 season, with Nigel Mansell achieving 12th place as his best result. But then, at the end of that season, ground effect was banned from Formula One for safety reasons. That was 1994, a very sad season when people died. All of a sudden, the system seemingly lost its purpose, right? Maybe not. But Lotus ends up giving up on that. Or at least the topic, which gets a bit forgotten because on top of everything, Colin Chapman would die on December 16th, 82. And then Peter Wright takes what they had already developed and hands it over to the Lotus Road Car division to move forward. And then, at the end of 1986, the topic comes back to discussion within Lotus, and the team decides. In 87, this thing is going to debut, or in this case, re-debut, and it would end up working, especially on street circuits. Ayrton Senna wins 2 races with the Yellow Lotus that year, specifically not on city tracks, Detroit and Monaco, both with pretty bad asphalt. Williams, on the other hand, had a slightly different approach than Lotus, as I mentioned. Lotus thought, let's keep the car's height constant all the time and let the aerodynamics do its job separately. On the other hand, Williams wanted to use suspension to help with aerodynamics, allowing for more extreme designs to be implemented. For example, making the rear of the car sit lower on the straights in a sort of DRS, because that would negate the angle of attack of the floor, like when an airplane wing stops producing lift at certain moments, creating a difference in top speed. This allowed for more aggressive aerodynamic setups, because you could use more downforce knowing that it would help you in high-speed corners and knowing that the rear would sit lower on the straights. You don't have to worry so much about the aerodynamic drag that holds the car back. Besides that, knowing that the active suspension would never let the car touch the ground on the asphalt. You could go much lower, because the suspension, stupid, let's put it this way, with springs, doesn't guarantee you that. And so, driving lower, more downforce, with the guarantee of not having that problem. Because, might be thinking, but hitting the car on the asphalt has to have a bad effect. The effect is that when the car hits, the airflow is interrupted. So you lose downforce, not completely, because the asphalt is never going to hit flat, entirely on the ground. But part of it does, and there, in that spot, the airflow is interrupted or greatly affected, and you have a significant and abrupt loss of downforce. Williams would also come out with this system. In 87, Nelson Piquet won a race in Monza using active suspension, but everything was still very complicated to make it work, and Sir Frank's team decides to continue. In 88, 89, 90, and even 91, testing the system for thousands of kilometers. In fact, one of the engineers who worked on the active suspension software at Williams would later return there. In 2019, Paddy Lowe, who had been with Mercedes during the Hamilton-Rosberg era, would later return there in that embarrassing situation. By the end of 1991, Williams seemed to have reached the state of the art, and they decide to debut the system in the 1992 season with the FW14B. The focus on developing active suspension was so intense that the rest of the car was pushed forward with few aerodynamic changes, and it would pay off. The evolution of Adrian Newey's first car for Williams in 1991 would give Nigel Mansell the world title, and it would be, in the words of Ayrton Senna himself, a car from another planet. And Senna wasn't exaggerating when he said that, because the rest of the grid at the beginning of '92 was still struggling with springs and shock absorbers. When McLaren appeared with the car for the '92 season, only in the third stage of that championship, it becomes clear that they had missed the boat in history, and that they would have to work really hard to achieve something in '93, because the new model, there were still springs and shock absorbers in the suspension. The active suspension from Williams allowed Adrian Newey to push the limits of bold aerodynamics, something he had already tried to do at Leighton House and had failed. I've already told this story in this video here, link in the description. Newey was fired from Leighton House because of a faulty wind tunnel. And when Leighton House raced on a neighboring asphalt track, hour by hour, they almost had a 1-2 finish with Capelli and Mauricio Gugelmin. In '93, Williams debuted the FW15, a more advanced car. Still, this time, McLaren had done their homework, and Senna's car also had a pretty modern active suspension. Over time, Benetton, Ferrari, Lotus, the more or less structured teams on the grid, started adopting the systems, and the rising costs were killing the teams from the bottom up. This and the competition from Indy, that in '93 there was a memorable season, with Emerson Fittipaldi and Nigel Mansell battling for the championship, made Formula One think, we need to ban all of this. And then in one fell swoop, they warned traction control, brakes, ABS, active suspension, and all these gadgets will be banned for '94. In fact, I already talked about this in the video about the history of a controversial car, Benetton B194, which I released weeks ago. It's worth watching. And one last detail, Williams still doesn't go into operational details about the active suspension, thinking about the possibility of one day it becoming legal in Formula One again. And they still think that even 30-something years later, they have an advantage over the rest. And that's why they don't share details about how the system worked. So that was another episode of Splash and Go on YouTube. I hope you all enjoyed it. Leave a like, it's free. It doesn't cost anything and helps the channel a lot. Break this for me, break this for us, and leave your hype with us. This YouTube tool is for you to show it to the blessed mysterious algorithm that you like the channel, you like our videos, and it helps us grow, galloping since our departure from Flow at the end of last year. I always say here that our audience is the best Formula One audience in Brazil, because every time I ask you to leave a like, you do. We have more likes, more comments, and now more hype. Channels with 10, 12 times our number of subscribers. So, leave a like. It doesn't cost anything and helps the channel a lot. If you want to receive notifications for each of our videos, which have video and content here all the time, we have channels on Telegram and WhatsApp. Link down below in the description in the center and start receiving a little message. As soon as I publish each of the videos, as soon as the news comes out, breaking news, and the race schedules throughout the season. You can also follow us on our social media, Instagram, Twitter, Threads, and TikTok. We now have my personal Instagram and the websites, flashandgo.com.br. Wherever you want, you'll find us. They're showing the handles here, link down below in the description. All right, so that's it. Thanks and a big hug.